Hi, good evening, ladies.
Good
Hi, how are
evening.
you?
I am doing well. It is so great to see both of you and right on time. So kudos. Um, I just wanted to say welcome to everyone that is tuning in and joining us this evening. I'm Jeric Richardson, the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the National Urban League. And tonight we are hosting another one of our Justice Now conversations that's sponsored by the National Urban League. And we're looking forward to discussing a very controversial topic that really has been in the headlines all over the news: abortion rights and the attacks on Roe versus Wade. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and here to break it down for all of us are two amazing leaders in each of their own rights. We have Jennifer Jones Austin, who is a radio host and author, the CEO and executive director of FPWA. So for those of you that don't know the acronym, it's the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, which is really an anti-poverty policy and advocacy nonprofit. And then I'm also joined by one of my National Urban League colleagues, Yvette Badanumako, who is an attorney, and she also serves as a senior director for judiciary, civil rights, and social justice at the League. And Yvette focuses on the federal courts, nominations, civil rights, and criminal justice reform. So needless to say, we have the right women for this really important conversation. Welcome, Jennifer and Yvette. So great to have you.
It's so good to be here, and I'm just grateful and appreciative, so thankful that you're bringing forth and talking with our community about such a critical and important issue.
Great. Well, why don't we get started? So Yvette and I actually were talking earlier today, and on Monday, the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments in the Texas abortion law case. And so that's Senate Bill 8. It's one of the among others, because Mississippi has its own abortion law that really is impacting so many women, especially Black and brown women of color, which is what I really want to zero in on in this conversation. But Yvette, why don't you start us off and just give all of our viewers a little bit of background on this law, and really talk about how it's gone into effect and its impact thus far.
Yeah, so the Texas abortion law, which is in effect, the Supreme Court declined to block it going into effect. So unfortunately isn't in effect today. What it would do is essentially would allow any private citizen to sue anyone who performs an abortion in the state after an embryo's embryonic activity or cardiac activity can be detected. So essentially that means private citizens are deputized to enforce this abortion law. It's very, very novel. We have not seen an abortion bill like this. It's also the most restrictive abortion law in the country. It effectively bans abortions after 6 weeks. And, you know, it does also permit abortions for specific health reasons. However, the exceptions are really narrowly drawn. It allows termination if there's a pregnancy that can endanger the mother's life. However, it does not exempt people who are raped or are pregnant as a result of incest. So we're seeing a really restrictive abortion law, and that is a question that we will see the Supreme Court take up on Monday.
Yvette, thanks for unpacking that for us. You know, I think it's really important just to give context when we're having conversations like these. And so, Jennifer, I would love to hear from you about how this law already exacerbates an existing system that in many cases fails people of color, people from other marginalized communities.
So let's begin with a fact. Whether we like it or not, it is a fact that Black and brown women, and primarily younger women and of lower income, receive abortions at a higher rate than white women. Now, that is not because of some individual failing, although many in society would like to have us think that. They'd like to have us think that it's because of our actions, that we're just, kind of free with our bodies and not really taking good self-care. That is not the case at all. What it really is a factor of our income and racism. It's a factor that is based on, years of misogynistic and sexist treatment of Black women. The treatment and the viewing of Black women as nothing more than medical bodies, going back to slavery, right? When, and the years since, when our bodies were used as though we were like living and breathing cadavers for gynecological experimentation. It has everything to do with the withholding of basic resources, including access to quality health care, access to quality reproductive health care, access to affordable health care. In many states, including Texas, they didn't accept the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. And so what you have, in short, is, just the continuation of structural systemic racism, where Black and brown women have lower wages, job segregation to begin with. We have less access to reproductive health care. And all of that then spirals into unintended, unplanned pregnancies. And what is the recourse? If you're young and you can't afford to have a child, you're not ready to have a child, then because of the way the system is structured, you're more likely to receive an abortion. So now what they're seeking to do is to limit your access to that. Well, let's just ponder this for a moment. The fact of the matter is that in America, 1 in 4 Black children grow up living in poverty, as compared to less than 1 in 10 white children. So now, if you're burdening Black women who you've denied fair income and wages, you've denied quality access to health, access to quality health care, access to quality reproductive rights. Now you want to take away or limit the right to have an abortion. Then essentially what you're doing is you're forcing more and more Black women and brown women to have more babies, which contributes to a higher poverty rate, and then just deepens the intergenerational experience of women and children not having the resources they need to survive and to thrive. It's just a perpetuation of systemic and structural racism.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's clear that this issue is one that is so pertinent and relevant for our communities. And we're talking about this, and we started off with the framework of Texas. But I would love to hear from you, Yvette. Is this a national trend? Is this new focus and these policy changes around abortion? Is it happening in a vacuum? Is just Texas the bad actor? How should we be looking at policies like this?
Yeah, it is not happening in a vacuum, Jerica. What we are seeing is that in 2021 alone, I believe it's about 90 anti-abortion laws that have been passed in state legislatures across the country. They might not be as novel as the Texas abortion law, in which it uses private citizens to enforce it. However, we are seeing so many restrictions, and we really expect to see more that may be similar to the Texas abortion law, despite the fact that it's being challenged by the Supreme Court.
So yeah, it's not just Texas. And we've seen, whether we're talking about voting rights or we're talking about policing issues, when these things arise in one state, I mean, what we've seen in 2021 is not only are we dealing with the pandemic of 2020, but we start to see a pandemic of other proportions with these social justice issues. And abortion is one that may not always have been framed as a social justice issue or a racial justice issue, but clearly with the information that you laid out for us earlier, Jennifer, it is. And I want to pick up on something that you said in your earlier comments. You mentioned the term slavery. When I think about this Texas law, and it's essentially authorizing vigilantism, and it's rewarding people $10,000 for suing someone that helped facilitate an abortion, right? Just assisted a young woman in the process in some way, shape, or another. That has to have huge implications for our society. Jennifer, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, we know that vigilantism is essentially being held up and propped up as, you're saving the country. Just look at January 6th, right? The insurrection. You're saving the country. So, by empowering a private right of action on the part of any ordinary individual in Texas, you're saying to those people, you're on the moral side of the law. You're the good people, and you're going to take down these bad actors. Essentially what it is it's by design, because what the state legislature realized is that by creating this private right of action, essentially, it causes the Supreme Court, which it did. The Supreme Court took the bait to pause, because it's not the government that's acting, right, per se. It's not the government that's that's actually trying to challenge the Roe v. Wade and enforce this law that they know is not right. Because essentially what Roe v. Wade did was Roe v. Wade said, first 24 weeks of pregnancy, a woman has a right to choose, and there really are no exceptions to the rule. So then Texas comes along and says, after the 6th week, it's fully banned. So essentially, when you have the private individual taking action, it's not the state going against the federal government, which then calls into question whether or not there is a right of action, right? You get what I'm saying? So they did this cleverly. It's not just about empowering, the everyday individual. They just wanted to find a way to get around the law so that they could get up into the Supreme Court. That's what they did here. And it's very similar to what we've seen with a lot of the voting rights, the dismantling of voting rights. These are just clever strategies to try to work around to get to the Supreme Court. And the concern here is that we're going to see this popping up in many different places and spaces. It's just, it's just clever actions on the part of lawyers, figuring these workarounds, trying to find those cracks and let the water seep on through.
Clever actions, maybe, but it's really having profound impacts on so many people in this country. I mean, it can completely change the trajectory of someone's life. And I mean, just from a health standpoint, there are so many reasons why abortions are needed for medical necessity. And this 6-week law that Texas is trying to really enforce is going to put so many people at risk unnecessarily that wouldn't have needed to be in that situation. So, I'm curious. We've all been having this conversation in the public. Yvette, can you speak to what the administration, the Biden administration, has been saying about this very issue? Has there been any action taken at all?
Yes, so the Department of Justice has brought a case into the Supreme Court challenging the abortion law, specifically saying that SB 8 interferes with their interest in protecting the constitutional rights of citizens that reside in the state. So that is the question that will be considered during oral arguments on Monday. Whether the federal interest in ensuring that states recognize constitutional rights are upheld, and whether the state law preempts the federal government by threatening the work that they are tasked to do, who might offer abortion services. So they are very, very active in this fight, and we will see what the DOJ presents to the court on Monday.
If I may just add there, what we're seeing, this situation in many ways, just building on what Yvette said, and she's right on point, it mirrors what we're seeing with the voting rights, the dismantling of voting rights. And part of our challenge is, just as we've seen with this legislature, the Congress, over the course of the last several years, this failure to act, the failure to codify voting rights legislation after the Supreme Court struck down one of the most essential provisions that centered on preclearance when states and localities that had histories of discrimination with respect to voting. Essentially what the Supreme Court did was it kicked it back to Congress and said, you need to come up with another standard, that looks to ensuring preclearance for those states and those localities that still appear to be engaging in efforts that would disenfranchise people or take away their vote. You need to be looking at that, and you need to come up with the legislation. Congress didn't act. Well, here again, Congress should codify Roe v. Wade and essentially, legislate a woman's right to choose. In the absence of doing that, you have these state actions, state legislatures that are just having their day, playing with lives, human lives. So once again, we're seeing this failure on the part of Congress to essentially hold up the Constitution and give it life through legislation that once federal legislation is passed and it codifies the constitutional right, then the states can't chip away at that. Or it gets challenged again in court. But not these one-offs. That's the problem that we're having right now. So, the Biden administration, in addition to admonishing states to do the right thing, should actually be pressing Congress to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Similar to us seeing the voting rights legislation pass through the House and not make it through in the Senate, we're seeing the same thing with anti-abortion efforts and the resulting codification of Roe v. Wade by passing a similar legislation through the House and not having it go through the Senate. So we're still waiting for the Senate to consider legislation that would codify Roe v. Wade, and we have yet to see any action. It's super unfortunate because this is the moment where we're seeing so many voter suppression efforts in the same states that we are seeing anti-abortion laws.
Indeed. And, one of the other things that Congress could do concerning, addressing this challenge and this problem is not specifically abortion-centered, but it is tied to resources and supports for women of color. So let's just begin with pay equity and addressing job segregation. If Black and brown women were paid, fairly for their work and the value of their work, then, we wouldn't have so many living in poverty and not being able to access quality health care. Let's take a look at the reconciliation bill that is being held up right now. A bill that it would provide for increased healthcare services, funding for increased reproductive health, funding for early childhood education, which takes a lot of money out of the pockets of low-income women, primarily Black and brown women here in America, but also across the nation. Funding for community college, which would boost wages and essentially lessen the debt and the burdens that low-income women have. I could go on and on and on, but these are the things that tie in with quality health care and reproductive health. If Black and brown women don't have the resources available to them to make decisions that are in the best interest of themselves and their families, then this is what happens. They get tripped up. And abortion, whether they want it or not, pregnancies unintended become addressed through this means.
I mean, that is very clear. These are structural issues. And so you've given us a laundry list of what our elected officials can do to create a more equitable and a more just system. But especially when we're looking at the Senate, as you said before, they're failing to act. And I think there needs to be a response from the American people. There needs to be a response from this movement and so many communities across the globe and here in the US that we need you to do your job.
Absolutely.
not just on this issue, but on so many other issues. And I'm glad, Jennifer, that you really, pointed to voting in this conversation, because that's the basis of it all. We can't get the change that we seek if we are not even able to protect our fundamental right to vote and our access to the ballot box. So just like this issue of abortion, that too is under attack. And I'm curious, you've talked about what could be, and the positives that could happen if folks act. But I want to make sure that we paint a clear picture for individuals. If the Supreme Court rules these laws from Texas and Mississippi as constitutional, what will be the outcome? How will that look in society? How will our communities be impacted?
Whew, as you ask that question, chills run through my body. Let's just simply begin with what we saw before Roe v. Wade became law. We saw women resorting to measures, to end their pregnancies that often resulted in, death, in serious, injury. So we begin there. Then we look at that, what it may mean for many women, especially young women, having babies that they're not ready to have, and the stressors that attend. Lower income persons who do not have the resources available to care for growing families. And let's just add a federal government that knows this oh so well and does not provide requisite child care, housing supports, healthcare supports, mental health supports, and all other necessary supports to help people meet their basic needs. We're going to see increased stressors, adverse childhood experiences that lead to perpetual and systemic, disparate outcomes for children and families in everything from education to mental health and well-being, perpetuating trauma that keeps children and mothers and families from being, well and engaged, and essentially active and productive. We're going to see the further erosion of a lot of meaningful relationships, men and women, strained relationships. It's all going to contribute to what was intended way back in slavery, which is the further dismantling of Black and brown families and the mental and emotional well-being of Black and brown mothers, fathers, women, children, that then just repeats the cycle generation after generation after generation.
Yeah. Jennifer, that is so deep and so moving. And, I'm sure for those who are tuning in, just the weight of that kind of just sits there. I think when we're talking about social justice issues, it's important, and we fundamentally believe at the National Urban League that it starts with the education on the issues, and it starts with the conversations. But we have to engage, we have to act, we have to legislate, we have to advocate. And so I would love to give each of you a few minutes to talk about how folks that are really interested in engaging and helping this work and making sure that it is happening in an equitable and just way, how they can join the movement, how can they engage around advocacy. Yvette, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I would say, first off, contact your member of Congress. Emphasize the urgency of the moment to codify Roe v. Wade. A lot of these states have these trigger laws that as soon as Roe v. Wade is overturned, bans or nearly complete abortion bans will happen across the country. So it will happen immediately unless we take action. So definitely contact your member of Congress, contact your senator, let them know they need to take up legislation that would codify Roe v. Wade and block these abortion bans.
I could not agree with you more. And the other thing that I would suggest is that people Google there's a coalition of 8 reproductive and healthcare Black-centered women's organizations that are leading a Black reproductive justice policy agenda. And their agenda is spot on. It calls for us to act to move Congress to end the federal ban on funding for abortion care. I mean, essentially, I shouldn't say to end it, but to ensure that against any bans that would allow for abortion not being funded. So remember, when the Republicans were trying to undo the Affordable Care Act, one of the things that they sought to do was to essentially dismantle what President Obama had put in there around the funding of reproductive health. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to ensure that they put in place legislation that ends any bans that would be in place against funding for abortion care. The other thing that they need to do, something that we can take, a page out of the book, and I love that this reproductive justice agenda centers on this. Just as we had a pre-clearance requirement for voting, for any state or local actors to try to put in place legislation that might inhibit or prevent Blacks from voting based on prior experiences, we could put in place through legislation a pre-clearance requirement that requires that states, when they're moving to take actions concerning abortion, to put in place legislation that centers on, restricting abortion, that they've got to run that through the Department of Justice. They've got to run it through the federal Congress. Something that says you're going to have a checks and balances system, some type of quality control. They could put in place a pre-clearance requirement. And then the other thing that they should do is ensure that there's federal legislation, and this is all part of the reproductive justice agenda, put together by Black women, Black organizations centering on reproductive justice for Black women and brown women. They could also suggest through legislation, push through legislation that says that there should be a limitation on out-of-pocket expenses for reproductive health care, because that's what keeps tripping us up. If we don't have the resources, the reason we struggled so much and continue to struggle through COVID is that our wages are so suppressed. We don't have the discretionary income beyond fixed expenses to address some of these issues. And high out-of-pocket expenses for reproductive health care keep us from accessing it. So I would encourage people to learn more about the reproductive justice agenda that is being led by these 8 Black women-led reproductive and healthcare organizations, so that they can then get the information that they need to do just as Yvette is saying. Take on Congress, push them to do what's right.
I love that. And I love the pre-clearance idea. It's brilliant. It brings us back to John Lewis, and all the strategies that we saw. We have them in our toolkit. We've been using them. The civil rights playbook is amazing, and we have the opportunity to apply it to the issues of the day. So thank you so much for lifting that up and really reminding us how important it is to have Black and brown women at the table and really pushing this agenda forward. We are impacted, I think, far more than we should be on this issue and so many more. And I think we've looked.
I just want to say I'm smiling at you because earlier today I was on a panel discussion concerning criminal justice, and someone said, well, how do we get a seat at the table? That was a question from the audience. And what I'm reminded of in this moment is that these Black-led organizations essentially came together as a coalition and said, we don't need you to give us a seat at the table. We're actually going to set our own table.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. And we have seen the really rise and the power, and I think the growth and assertiveness of Black women, where we move from the Shirley Chisholm age, where we ask for the seats, But right now, you're right. We are setting the table. And quite frankly, we're building the table, building the strategy, and pulling everybody else along. And that's what we need to do for this issue and so many more. Um, I have learned so much in this conversation from both of you, and I will definitely be watching to see what happens on Monday. We'll be watching to see what happens on the Mississippi front in December as well. But before we wrap, I really would love to just give you each a few minutes to share some final words on this topic and really the importance of us and remembering and really focusing on it from a racial justice, a social justice, and equity space. Yvette, why don't you start? And Jennifer, you can close us out.
Yeah, of course. So, here at the Urban League, Jeric and I talk about this a lot, how so many things intersect with the struggle of being Black in America and the importance of ensuring that all of our rights are protected. We are ultimately an organization that ensures that Black and underserved communities are empowered economically, but also that their fundamental civil rights are protected and upheld, because Black people cannot thrive without having their basic civil rights protected. And that's something that we need to look out for. There's so many overlaps between what we have seen, like we mentioned earlier, voting suppression laws with anti-abortion laws. We're seeing it in other avenues of civil rights as well. It's so important to remain vigilant, to vote. It's an off year for congressional and federal elections. However, state and local jurisdictions do have elections, and they impact what laws go through, what anti-abortion laws get blocked. So be active, be engaged, vote, contact your member of Congress, and, keep moving, keep thriving.
Oh, yeah. I'm
Thanks,
right
Yvette.
there with you. If I may just add, let's not get distracted. And let's always keep in mind that the aim of those who want structural and systemic racism to stand up and endure are going to continually try to find those things that would separate and divide us. You mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, Jerica, that I lead FPWA, which stands for the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. I bring that up again because of the word Protestant. It is a faith-rooted organization. And one of the things that has happened in this debate around abortion, and especially in the Black community, is that there have been those that have made it a moral issue. Rather than an issue centered on social and political and economic, capitalist, structurally based racist issues, they've made it about morality. And what they've tried to do is to get a lot of people in the Black community who are of faith to center on the morality or the immorality of abortion. Well, this is how I think about this issue. How is it that you've got all of these white evangelicals so concerned about the Black child, the Black baby, yet they don't care one bit about the Black child's mommy? They don't care about that Black child when it comes to education. They don't care about that Black child and the Black family when it comes to incarceration, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to housing, when it comes to voting rights, to any basic civil and human liberties and rights, right? But now you want to make it a moral issue in this moment. It's intended to divide. And what we really need to center on is the Black family. And how do we ensure that we hold up women and children? And we ensure that just like everybody else in this society, we have a right to choose, and we have the education that we need to be informed and make informed decisions. Don't get distracted.
We certainly can't afford to get distracted. We have to stay focused on this issue and really cut out the noise. I mean, I just really thank you for your comments, because talking about the morality piece and folks' actions not necessarily matching up with what they espouse. I mean, I think that's important. The word is hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy. if we care for one, we have to care for all. We shouldn't be picking and choosing who we support and whose life matters and whose life is valuable. So that was such an important point to lift up. So as we close, I do want to remind folks that this issue is critical. It's important. If we look at 2021 alone, there have been 90 different abortion restrictions that have come out during this cycle. So, you know, again, as Jennifer said, don't get distracted. This isn't just a Texas issue. As Texas goes, therefore may go many parts, if not the rest of this nation. And so the reminder is how pressing this is. So I encourage you to continue educating yourself on this issue, get engaged. There are so many different organizations that you can connect with if you want to get more involved in the policy piece or the advocacy piece. I encourage you to do it, but do something. And as we say on this show, it's important to move forward because the time for justice is always now. So Yvette, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. We at the League and our entire movement really appreciate your work. And thanks for fighting the good fight. We look forward to having you on again, and to all of our viewers, please join us next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.